How's everybody doing this morning? Happy Palm Sunday. I guess that's what you say. Happy Palm Sunday. So, this is a good sign, isn't it? My friend, the whiteboard. You guys can't see it over there, though, so just shove some stuff out of the way here. So, we have been talking about the resurrection and its implications, what it means for us today. And so we'll get into that in a minute. But before we begin, we'll do some brainstorming. I get to write on the whiteboard in letters that you can't read. So it's exciting times for me anyway. So what I want us to think about is I want to do some word association. We're going to celebrate this Friday the death of Jesus. And we celebrate that for a lot of different reasons. We call it Good Friday, but it wasn't very good for him at the time. But what I want to ask you is, what kind of words could we use to describe the experience of Jesus on the cross? What he experienced on that Good Friday so many years ago. What kind of words? So I'm just looking for kind of one words, like, I'll give you one. It was unfair. What happened to him? What else? Rejection. Okay, give me some time. Humiliating, pain, torture. What else? Betrayal. Sadness. Agony. Overwhelming. Excruciating. And look at that word crush in there, which is actually goes back to crucify. What's that? Relief. Is that what you said? I don't know. I thought you said it. I wrote it down. What else? Selfless. Obedient. Planned. Love. And I'm going to write alone as the last one. We're out of space. No more. Okay. And then let's talk about what the experience of the resurrection was like. What kind of things could you use to describe that? Victory. Oh, that was two at the same time. Mysterious. Surprising. Happiness. Joyous. I'm going to write joy because there's not room. All right. What else? Predicted. Reunion. What's that? Disbelief. Celebration. Fulfillment. Bridge. I almost did the bridge illustration for Barb on a napkin at Tim Hortons so that she could. That's a really insider, weird Christian joke right there, so I'm sorry to everyone. What else? What's that? Needed. Can I get a little hope in there? Glorious. I'm going to put the word life as the last one. Okay. That's it. We'll see you guys next week. No, just kidding. What? So there we go. Thank you for that. That's helpful, and we'll come back to that later. And for now, it can just sort of live there, and you can try to figure out why I wrote things the way I did. But like I said, for the last couple of weeks, we have been talking about the resurrection. That's what we celebrate next Easter. It's one of the things that's at the center of our Christian faith. But we've been talking about how we believe that the resurrection, as Christians, we believe that the resurrection wasn't just something that did happen, like 2,000 years ago to Jesus. And it's not just something that we believe will happen when Jesus comes again. But we believe, and the Bible teaches, that resurrection is something that is happening in our lives today. That resurrection for us is a present reality. And the New Testament returns to that as a theme again and again. but it kind of gives several different facets to how resurrection works in our lives. So the first week we talked about a resurrection mindset where Paul says, since you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts and set your minds on things above. And we heard a story of how Martha did that through her journey with cancer and how she kept her mind on God during even the difficult times. She had a new way of looking at things, a new mindset. And then last week we talked about how Paul said in Romans 6 that as those who have been brought from death to life, we should offer ourselves to God. And that he was going to help us live a new life. And we got to hear James Hunt's story of his delivery out of slavery to alcoholism into a place where he's serving God. And so we see resurrection in those stories, and we see resurrection in those parts of our lives. But one thing we didn't talk about in detail, at least last week when we talked with James, was how difficult life has been along the way since he became a Christian. See, I've walked with James on that journey, and I've known and I've watched his thing after thing as he's done his best to offer himself to God as someone who's been brought from death to life, and thing after thing goes wrong. And I just want to say that is one of the real problems with this whole Christianity thing, is all the junk that happens to us. Am I right? Yeah. If I were designing Christianity, I would have made it so that things went really bad in your life before you were a Christian. And then when you came to Christ and you believed in him and you experienced that connection with God through Jesus, everything in your life after that point would go well. That's how I would design it. Doesn't that make sense? That is just pure behavioral science. If you want to get people to behave a certain way, you need to reward them for it. And so, if I were God, that's how I would do things, but it does not seem to be the kind of Christianity that we see either in the Bible or in real life. And so that's what I want to dig into today. Not just God's power to bring new life and to give us a new mindset, but when the terrible, awful things of life happen to us, God's power of resurrection to be at work in those things. So, now the interesting thing is, at least, since that's not what we experience in our life, that's not what Jesus experienced, right? We just listed out a few things that he experienced that weren't so good. And it's not what his disciples after him experienced, his closest friends. Tradition tells us except for maybe John, were all martyred for their faith. So they didn't continue, I don't know, sometimes we get this idea that the disciples continued Jesus' mission somehow out of personal gain. No, they suffered the same things that he did and eventually were put to death for their faith. In fact, tradition says Peter was crucified upside down because he didn't feel worthy of being crucified right side up like Jesus. So wrap your head around that one for a minute. So as Jesus' followers 2,000 years later, the idea that life is going to be easy, pleasant, that everything's always going to go right, that God just wants us to be happy and healthy and wealthy, so that we can just have a full and abundant life. Maybe there's some bits of truth to that, but it certainly isn't the whole picture, and it never has been. The Apostle Paul was one of the leading figures in the early church, in early Christianity, and he describes his pleasant life in 2 Corinthians, starting at chapter 11, verse 24. And he just kind of lists out some of the things that had happened to him. He says, 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 39 lashes was the most amount of, if you're going to whip someone, you can only whip them 39 times. So that was the maximum penalty as far as being whipped. So 5 times that happened to him. Think about how many days that would take to recover from that, how much that would hurt. Then he says, 3 times I was beaten with rods. It was sort of a different experience. You can sort of compare them, right? Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. Imagine the fear of being shipwrecked. I spent a day and a night in the open sea. Just think about that for a minute. Would you have some questions for God after 24 hours in the water? Wasn't I trying to serve you, God? Wasn't I on my way to start another church or to bring your message, and yet you've left me in the water for a whole day? Thank you. I have been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. And yet we have a saying that says the safest place to be is in the center of the will of God. Well, Paul might question that. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. So it's not just physical afflictions, but emotional. Who is weak and I don't feel weak? Who is led into sin and I do not inwardly burn? Sounds like a nice life, doesn't it? You know? I just had this picture as I was reading that of like a best-selling book, The Life God Blesses by the Apostle Paul. And he could tell you how to live such a great life as well. Eventually, Paul, tradition tells us, was killed under persecution under the Emperor Nero. This was a time in the 60s AD, so shortly after Christianity started, where Nero blamed the Christians for the destruction or the fire in Rome, and so he persecuted them harshly. He did fun things like they would take the hides of animals and sew the Christians into them and then put them into the arena with wild dogs to tear them apart. Or they would put on wax-soaked clothing and then use them to light their garden parties. The kind of persecution that these early Christians suffered almost serves as evidence that God was not on their side, that somehow they were cursed, that God had abandoned them, that God was trying to punish them somehow. And I think even today, that's the temptation when bad things happen to us, when life goes poorly. We have this temptation to think that because things aren't going well, maybe God's ticked at us. Maybe God's left the building. Maybe it's a sign that we've done something that's made him mad, or for some reason he just doesn't like us. He's hitting the smite button whenever we move. But that's not how the New Testament looks at pain and suffering and affliction. It treats actually those bad things that happen as a normal part of Christian life. There's a great story of Teresa of Avila, who was a Carmelite nun in the 1500s. And she was this incredible woman of God and a strong leader in the church. She's traveling away from Avila to start new ministries in other towns, but the journey turns out to be extremely hard and dangerous. Rivers are flooding. They can't find the road. And everything is difficult. Nothing seems to go right. I don't know if you've ever had those experiences in life. And she says what probably a lot of us have thought, because she had this very familiar way of talking to God. And she said, "Oh, my Lord, when will you stop scattering obstacles in our path? Like, you're doing this, and it's really annoying." And God sort of whispered in her ear, and he said, "Don't complain, my dear daughter. This is how I treat all my friends." And she said, "No wonder you have so few." I don't know if you've ever felt that way, if you've ever felt like saying to God, if this is how you treat your friends, no wonder you have so few. But I think all of us have had experiences in our life, if we've started to follow God and started to try to walk in his ways, and yet bad things happen. And we go, is this a sign? Is God against me somehow? I think each of us could make a list somewhat like Paul's. Now, probably none of you have been lashed 5 times. But some of you may have had health problems that just keep coming up over and over again. Probably none of you have been beaten with rods, but maybe you've lost your job at exactly the wrong time in life. Maybe your car breaks down at the least opportune time. Make the list of things that seem to go against us. And sometimes those things are small and annoying, and sometimes they're huge and tragic and life-changing. And sometimes it's the period that we go through where it seems like everything goes wrong at once. Your car breaks down, your dog dies, and your furnace goes kaput all in the same week, or something like that. It just seems like a string of bad luck is following you, and you wonder why. Or maybe it's big things in your life. You want to be married, but you're not. Or you want to be unmarried, but you feel stuck. Maybe it's your health or your career or your family or your finances. Something is always going wrong and it feels like you're under attack. And maybe it is an attack. Maybe it's a coordinated effort of Satan, trying to throw you off track. That could be it. Or maybe it's just that we live in a fallen world where bad things happen. I don't have the explanation of why the bad things happen and why sometimes they seem to line up. But what happens, or what I do have, is the New Testament perspective or outlook on that. And that is this, that no matter what happens, no matter how many bad things come at us, God's resurrection power means that we can have a new outlook on it. That no matter how bad things get, it's always a chance for God to show his goodness. Now, listen to how Paul explains that, because, you may not take that very well from me. You might be able to say to me, well, Jeremy, you don't really understand how bad it is for me. It doesn't seem like God could in any way bring anything good out of it. But maybe you could listen to Paul and his list of awful things that happened to you, or that happened to him, and go, okay, here's a guy who knows what it's like to be serving God and doing his best, and yet experiencing terrible things. And this is what he has to say in 2 Corinthians 4, starting at verse 8. He says, we, meaning him, we are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned. We're struck down, but not destroyed. I wonder if he had in mind the beatings, the whippings. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. Interesting passage, isn't it? Completely different outlook on pain and suffering. So what's he saying? He's saying, first of all, he acknowledges, in my life I feel hard-pressed, I feel perplexed, I feel persecuted, I feel struck down. No, I don't just feel those things, but those things are actually happening. And some people were actually pointing to those things as evidence that Paul wasn't a very good apostle. So that's part of the theme of the letter in 2 Corinthians, is him sort of defending that God really did call him. And people have been saying, no, look at him. Look how badly things are going for him. How could he really be someone called by God if all those things are going bad? And Paul's going, yes, bad things do happen to me, but they don't completely overwhelm me. So yeah, I'm hard-pressed. I feel things closing in sometimes. Life just gets overwhelming, but I'm not crushed. Okay, I always sort of squeak through. I do experience persecution, yeah, but God is with me through all of it. I'm persecuted, but I'm never left alone. God's with me through that. And so he goes through it all. It reminds me of the old hymn called Tub Thumping, which says, we get knocked down, but I get up again. You're never going to keep me down. Sorry. So basically he's saying, yes, bad things happen to me, really bad things. I'm not crushed by them. I keep going. God gets me through. And then he brings up this theological explanation for it all. He says, we always carry around in our body the death of Jesus so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. Now, what does that mean, to carry around the death of Jesus? One of the commentaries I read thought that maybe Paul was referring to what were called epiphany processions, something that happened in his day in Greco-Roman society. And that was when a particular cult or religious group, so there were all kinds of them back then, right? Each god had their own little following, and a normal religious experience would have been to have a bunch of those that you picked and choose, sort of like buffet-style religion. And Christianity kind of came on and said, no, you only get one. And so that was part of maybe both the attractive part of Christianity and also the part that seemed very different from what they knew. But all these different cults and religions were always trying to attract new followers. And so one of the ways they did it, or some of them were, one of the ways they did that was by doing these epiphany processions where they paraded through the streets and they would carry the symbols of their particular god and goddess and proclaim his or her saving actions and just have all these symbolic representations and sacred objects that they paraded around, carried around, so that people could see. And so the commentary suggests that Paul's using that language here to basically say that we carry around, and there's another passage where he talks about being on parade like this, that we carry around this sacred center of our faith, the death of Jesus, his crucifixion. We carry that around so that people can see it. It can become real to them. And he says, so that, in order that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in us. Does that make sense? That we carry these things around, we put them on display. If the death and resurrection of Jesus are the things that are at the center of our faith, then we have the privilege of carrying them around, representing them to the world around us. What does that mean? What does it mean to carry around the death of Jesus? I mean, you could say stuff like dying to yourself, taking up your cross. Like, these are things that are familiar to us. But maybe if we're carrying around, if we're representing the death of Jesus through our lives, maybe we should not be so surprised when things that are unfair happen to us, when things that involve rejection or humiliation happen to us, when we have pain in our lives, when things seem almost torturous, when we're betrayed, when we're sad, when there's agony, when life seems overwhelming or excruciating. Maybe we shouldn't be surprised when the realities of Jesus' death are realities in our lives. But Paul doesn't say that's the end of it, like just, this is happy life. You get to carry around all those bad things. Paul says, those things are just there so that the life of Jesus may be revealed in them. You see, you can't have a resurrection without a death. If Jesus had just kept living, maybe we wouldn't celebrate Easter, right? Oh, he stayed alive. There is a song about that. But the fact that he died and then came back to life is what allowed God's power to be displayed in him. And I think what Paul is saying is that the fact that we experience these terrible things in life, it's not good. There's nothing good in and of itself. God does not delight in suffering or pain or to see us alone or sad. That doesn't make God happy. But they're part of living in a broken world. And whenever that happens, it's an opportunity for God to bring good, to bring life, to bring light. And so those things, when they happen to us, if we can adopt Paul's mindset, when we feel alone, when we feel overwhelmed, when we're in pain, when bad things sort of line up against us and life seems unfair, if we can adopt Paul's mindset here, we go, all right, that's normal for everyone. But for me as a Christian, it's a chance for the life of Jesus to be displayed in and through me. The resurrection power of God can be displayed by the way that God gets me through this, that I'm pressed in but not crushed. Things go really badly for me, but I'm not abandoned. God's with me through it. So I think that offers us a new outlook on the bad things that come in our lives. We who are alive, Paul says, are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. I can't give a full answer to why the bad things come in, but they do. And I can say that God wants to use them to reveal his life in us. Now, all of this points to the end of the story, when all of this pain and suffering and aloneness and all the things that we've lifted out will once and for all be crossed out, and all we have is life. But we're in in-between time now. And so Paul, just a few verses later, says, "For our light and momentary troubles," being beaten 5 times within an inch of his life, being left out at sea for a day and a night, being in danger wherever he goes. He says, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us a glory, an eternal glory, that far outweighs them all." So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. So for now, that would be my message. No matter how dark, how unfair, how hopeless, how unjust and alone things get in your life, if you're a follower of Jesus, it's an opportunity for his life to be revealed through you. And so, of course, as part of this series, one of the things we've been doing is finding stories that illustrate that this isn't just, nice notions in the sky, or, intellectualizing the faith, or Paul's weird theological, philosophical thoughts, but they're actual realities in our life. And so we've had actual stories from real people all along here. And so today I want to invite Barb McQuillan up to share part of the story of how God has worked in her life. Barb and her husband Richard have been coming to MCC, I think, for about a year. And let's see. Do you want to stand? That's a stand, not two stand. So there you go. I'll let you adjust the mic while I finish introducing you. So welcome, Barb. Where was I here? Oh, Richard did a lot of the electrical work. He's the reason that there's lights on right now in here. But he's not just an electrician. He has been a pastor for much of his life. And that makes Barb that strange animal known as a pastor's wife. And so I know that my wife absolutely 100% battles any of the stereotypes associated with it. And so I try not to judge as well. But, there's some things that you kind of think about a pastor's wife. But as I got to hear Barb's story, I realized that she had not sort of lived this sheltered, perfect life, but that she had experienced a lot of the junk that a lot of us go through. And she had lived a very real life. And I think that's great, because I think that makes you guys more relatable and able to understand. But I particularly want to go through back several years ago to a very messy time in your life. And so at this time, you have been married for 7 years, but not to Richard.
No.
To your first husband. And you have a 3-year-old and a 13-month-old. And you are getting ready to celebrate the wedding of your best friend. You were going to be the maid of honor. Your first husband was going to be the best man. And how far out was it from the wedding when you got the bad and confusing news?
Well, about 3 weeks before.
Pull that right close.
Okay. About 3 weeks before the wedding, my best friend called the wedding off. And I didn't know why at that time. 3 weeks later, my husband and I separated. And now what I didn't tell you, Jeremy, is that I cried on her shoulder for about 2 or 3 weeks after that, because I did not know it was her. And so the hurt and the pain and the loneliness of being a single mom, finding myself a single mom, he had told me when we were married, if I went back to work after we had children, that he would leave me. So now I'm unemployed. My husband has left. I'm crying on my best friend's shoulder, only a couple weeks later to find out that it was her that he was with.
Yeah. So take a look at this list here. There's some betrayal there, some rejection, some pain. So how were you feeling? Where was your sense of your emotional state and your sense of God in that moment?
It was very dark. I remember when he had told me that he was leaving, I crawled up in a ball on the floor, just fetal position, like I wasn't coping. I went for a walk. We were out in boonies, and I went for a walk, and then I got scared, and I came back home because I thought home was safe, but home really wasn't safe. And it was just...
Yeah, I can't imagine that. And but right away you began to see God provide. So explain that. You had a relationship with God at this time.
I had a
right?
relationship with God. I met God when I was 21, and that's another story. But at this time, I'm by myself. He said, quit being so lazy and get yourself a job, even though he didn't want me to work after I had children. And I've always said that God works at the last hour. I always said 10 to 12. 10 to 12 is when God works. And one day I was outside reading through the local paper, looking for a job, not knowing what I was going to do. And I seen a job for a rater in a customs brokerage. Now, I had been a customs inspector before that, before my first husband. When I first met my first husband, I was a customs inspector working in Niagara Falls. And I seen a brokerage looking for a rater, and that's a person who prepares the paperwork for the commercial trucks. At that time, it's very different now, but that's what we did. And so I thought I should call. And I thought, oh, well, I'll wait till this afternoon. But I felt very impressed that I needed to call right away. So I picked up the phone and I called Pat and told him who I was and what my experience had been. And he said, I was going to make my decision at noon today. I had decided that I was going to make my decision at noon. But since you've called, can you come down this afternoon? And I'd like to talk to you. And so I met him at 2 o'clock. And we talked for a bit. And he said, I've got a licensed broker that has applied for the job as well. Why should I hire you? Very fair question. And I said to him, because if you don't, my children and I will be living on $75 a week. And he said, and I also told him I was a customs inspector, and I used to verify your paperwork. So if I can verify your paperwork, I can get it right in the first place. And so he said he'd call me back. About an hour later, I got a phone call, and I wasn't expecting it that quick. And he said, you've got the job. Mm-hmm. So God works at 10 to 12.
Yeah. So part of the theme I want to bring out, because Barb's got a great and beautiful story, but we only have so much time. And so the theme that we're looking at is through this time as a single mom, which ended up being 11 years, you had both a unique relationship with God and you saw God come through for you in a lot of ways. So describe your relationship or your kind of deal with God.
Well, I took God at his word. If he said something, I believed it, and I challenged him on it. One of the songs, well, the song that carried me through much of my single parenthood it was by Nancy Honeytree, and it's called Jesus Be the Daddy of Our House. And it goes, because daddies are too hard to live without. At the end of every day, I get on my knees and pray, Jesus be the daddy in our house. And that's what it was. I remember I had been, after I went to the brokerage, I worked there for a year and a half. And then I applied for customs, and I didn't know whether the government would take me back. And I went for an interview and went through that process, and I did get a job back in the bridge. And so now I'm making really good money. At the brokerage, it was great because I was working afternoons. So I was only missing supper, bath, and bed. I was home with the kids all day. But now I'm at the bridge, I'm working shift work. So I'd get rid of my 4 to 12 shifts, and I'd work extra midnights, and I'd work at midnight. So I'd either be working while the kids were sleeping, and they'd be sleeping when I'm at work. And so it worked out. It worked out quite well.
I remember one of the things you said as far as when things went wrong in the house, your deal with God was?
My deal with God was, God, you've got a problem. I left the bridge after about 4 years, 5 years. And that's an entire story in itself. God had asked me to take 7 weeks off of work. I didn't understand this. I didn't know, and I didn't even know whether that was possible. So I knew I had 3 weeks vacation, started asking around, found out I could take 4 weeks unpaid leave, and so I did that. And during that time, one of my girlfriends needed a ride to Toronto. I was living in Niagara Falls at the time. She needed a ride to Toronto for blood work and testing. And so I took her and her 2 children to Toronto. On the way back, the transmission went on my car. And I limped the car home, took it to the transmission shop, and he says, Barb, you need a new or rebuilt transmission. What do you want me to do? And I had no money. And I said, kids and I need a car. Fix it. I had no idea how I was going to pay for it. And he called me and told me that the car was ready. And I had no idea how I was going to pay for it. Still went to the mailbox, and there was a check in the mail. Every time that I wanted child support, I had to go to court and fight for it. And sometimes, well, the first time I ever did that, my ex called Children's Aid screaming unfit mom, and I dealt with that. But it was just, anyways, about 4 years later, I left the bridge. And I had taken a course at Niagara Life Center working with unwed moms. And I felt that God wanted me to be there. So I didn't know how this was going to happen because I wasn't getting child support. I needed to be able to work. And so I went for an interview at Niagara Life Center, and I came back home and I said, okay, God, I have 2 children that I have to take care of. I'm a responsible person. I can do this now. I've got the financial means to be able to do this. And but if you want this to happen, you're going to have to sell my house, and I'm not willing to help you. And so
the job at Niagara Life Center was a more than 75% cut in pay.
Yes,
but you felt like God was pulling you to it.
It was less than half the hourly wage and only 20 hours a week. And so within half an hour after me saying that, the phone rang, and it was my real estate agent. Now remember, my house is not listed. She asked if she could show my house. And I hit the panic button, and I took off to my pastor's house and said, Jim, you'll never believe what happened. And he said, hang on, Barb, you might have a call from God there. And so I was praying and praying. I said, okay, God, what price do I ask for? And I had a number that was just sitting on my heart. And so the real estate agent came over, we talked, and I said this number. And she says, Barb, that's impossible. No house in this neighborhood has sold for that. It's $10,000 more than market value. I said, I don't care. I don't have to sell.
Which is back in the olden days.
Yeah, this
was
was
10,000 was a lot.
This was 88. And at that time, I was making $40,000 a year. My mortgage payments were $65, and
as I said,
$10,000 was a lot. So she calls me with an offer, and I said, "Is it what my asking price?" She said, "No," and I said, "But then I don't want it." And she says, "But I have to present you the offer." I said, "Fine, bring it over." So she came over. We had coffee. I signed it back to my price, because if I'm dealing with God, God's going to come through. And if I'm not dealing with God, I don't want anything to do with it. So another week later, she calls back, and I got the full pop. Now I'm really scared, because now I'm dealing with God. And so I took my kids to school, and on the way home, I was thinking, okay, this is only 20 hours a week at Niagara Life Center. I can work part-time at the Bridge, part-time at Niagara Life Center, because the Bridge would allow me to job share. So I'm on my way home, and from dropping the kids off, and I heard, you said you'd work full-time if the house sold. You never said anything about a full-time paycheck. And I'm going, oh, no. So I know I'm dealing with God. I want to serve him with all my heart. And fast forward till Christmas. Now, Easter, when my first husband had left, the only thing, I had no money. I had 35 cents. And my kids were 13 months and 3, so they didn't know the difference, but all I could give my kids for Easter was hard-boiled eggs and walnuts, and that was what they got for me. But God provided. All the neighborhoods, people, I mean, my kids had more chocolate than enough, especially at their age. And at Christmas, now, I've left the Bridge, I've gone to Niagara Life Center, Christmas is coming up, and I'm out of money again.
Your kids are a little older at that point.
The kids are older at this time, yes. Jess would have been 9, and Jeremy would have been 7. And
Not me.
Not
Different Jeremy.
Different Jeremy.
Yeah.
That lives down the street from his brother. But I remember it was 3 days before the 1st of December, rent's due, and I don't have money again. And I remember this song, Jesus Be the Daddy in Our House, and I prayed, and I said, God, you promised to be father to the fatherless. You promised to be husband to the husbandless. We've asked you to be daddy in our house. Rent is due in 3 days. I don't have the money. If you want me to get a second job, open the doors and I'll go through them. But I believe that I'm already spending too much time away from the house as it is. So God, rent's due in 3 days. You said you'd be father to the fatherless. You've got a problem. I said, it's daddy's job to take care of mommy and the kids, and that includes rent. You've got a problem. and when I'd pray, you've got a problem, I really did leave it at that. Because it wasn't mine anymore. I didn't carry it around. I didn't worry about it. It was, you've got a problem. Within the next day, I got a check. Actually, it was cash from a girlfriend who I'd lent money to. And it just happened to come out at the right time. And so I had enough money to pay the rent. I had enough money for groceries. And at Christmas time, like if I don't have enough money to pay December rent, I don't have any money for my kids for Christmas. Between then and Christmas, I had $1,200 from unexpected sources. And people would walk down the hall, say, Merry Christmas, Barb. They'd take their hand away, and I'd find a $50 bill in my hand. I left my office, and you know, if you have an office, you don't leave your purse alone in the office. Well, I forgot that, and I left my purse alone in the office, had to go someplace, came back, and it's overflowing with $20 bills. God was faithful. Yes, I went through the hard times. Yes, I spent a lot of time alone. My mom, I love her dearly with all my heart, but she was a person that said, you know, I've raised my kids, you need to raise yours. And she wasn't able to be there for me. My sister, she lived a different life, and she wasn't there for me. It was, I was alone, and it was the family of God that was there for me. And yes, I would go through what I went through again and again and again, because God does make beauty out of the tough times. I wouldn't be the person I am today if I hadn't gone through those times. And yeah, God, you've got a problem. and
Yeah. So this stuff we've talked about today, does that make sense to you?
Total
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. So you see, a lot of times we feel like the stuff in our life is like a sign maybe God's against us. But I think for Barb, it was this opportunity for God to come through and to show her how much he loved her. And you've got lots more story. Eventually you met Richard and were happily ever after. Nothing bad ever happened again.
Not.
If it was according to my plan. So anyway, If there's someone here or someone watching online who kind of feels like life's conspired against them, it's hard, it's unfair, they're alone, what would you say to them?
When you're at the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on. God is there. He loves you so much more than you could ever hope or imagine. And he's there for you. I told Jeremy, I said a phrase that Jeremy laughed at in a good way. And I keep on talking about pushing the faith button. And when I said, God, you have a problem, I'm pushing the faith button because I believe, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that it's his problem and not mine. I'm his child. He has to take care of me. He promised.
Yeah, and that goes for you whether you've been a Christian for 50 years or 5 minutes. God's love for you and his provision for you is not based on your performance, and it's not based on how great you are, how much you deserve it. It's based on his love for you. But I think sometimes our faith does affect it, and our ability to trust him sometimes opens up the door for this life stuff to be revealed. So that would be my encouragement to you, that in each of our lives, it's going to play this picture out. We always carry around the death of Jesus so that the life of Jesus can be revealed in and through us. So let's pray, and God, thank you for Barb's story. Thank you for the Apostle Paul's story. Thank you for each of our story, where we have encountered obstacles, where we've gone through hopeless or seemingly hopeless and painful and alone situations, and yet you have met us in them and brought good out of them. God, may we face the obstacles in life with faith and with this new outlook that says that whatever happens and however bad it looks, you have the power to bring good, and you have the power to bring light and life. I pray for people here who may be struggling, and they just feel at the end of their rope, they feel overwhelmed, they feel like life is so unfair. And I pray that you would reach out to them in such a tangible, comforting way and meet them and bring life out of death. And God, for those of us who have seen you work that way in the past, help us not to stop talking about it, not to stop giving you the credit where credit's due. As we go from this place, God, may we bring this experience of you, may we bring the hope that your resurrection brings, not just to our own little families and our own little worlds, but to the greater community around us, to everyone that we see and interact with. May we be your light in this community. In Jesus' name, amen.
Just add one more thing.
Yes?
The important thing, in spite of everything, what was done to me, I had to forgive. And it wasn't all his fault. You got that kind of a bit of the story. But you have to forgive. I forgave him. I forgave her. And I forgave myself. And that's the important part, is at the end of it all, you have to forgive. Absolutely.
So if anybody's going through stuff and they just want to talk to someone, I'd be happy to be available. I'm sure Barb would be happy to be available as well, too. So thank you, everyone. Have a great week and happy Easter.
Mm-hmm.